Hi there. This is my fifth one take video. This one will be for the hours. I know I'm a little bit behind, but I had to uh, mull things over and think of something intelligent to say about the hours. I think I've come up with something, but you, of course, will be the judge. So first, I want to, as I often do, begin with talking about the literary aspect of the film, The Hours. So, in other words, the book by Michael Cunningham, The Hours. But also, in a way, as I talked about it in my film essay, um, Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. So, I have read Mrs. Dalloway. It is a great book. It is a great example of stream of consciousness narrative style. But really, what I'd like to talk about is my experience of reading Virginia Woolf's other, actually, she probably has more than two, her other great stream of consciousness novel, To the Lighthouse. Is that backwards on your end? Anyway, no way, nothing I can do about that. Um, I first read To the Lighthouse. That was my first book that I read by Virginia Woolf. I probably would not have read it if not that I was under duress and in the form of being in a undergraduate class on British modern literature. As is often the case, I'm sure, with yourself, in my college years, I mean, some semesters were pretty jam-packed, and I didn't always get the reading done on time. I think I probably skipped some readings, to be honest. So it wasn't until the weekend before it was due that I read To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. I mean, first of all, in college classrooms, it's very rare these days that a whole novel would be assigned, but that was the case with To the Lighthouse. It's a great book, and actually getting it all done in one weekend can be a very amazing experience. At least it was for me. I do talk about this experience and this reading experience. I recount it in my classrooms and other places because I guess it attests to the power of literature. So particularly with a stream of consciousness novel, basically you're inside someone's head, and you're seeing their thoughts flow past. Um, and that is what happens when you read To the Lighthouse. Uh, One of the major character, the mother, the matriarch in the family, it's mostly in her head. So what that does is it allows you to identify with characters, uh, and it also takes you inside their head in terms of the narrative style. So in um, and I'll tell you right now, in terms of spoiler alert, if you ever do read the book, and I certainly encourage it. Halfway through the novel, the main character, the one you've been traveling around in their skin, in their head, dies. So it's actually a moment of when you realize that it can be a moment of real grief because you become so intimately connected with this particular character. So when she's gone, it's like, where do we go now? Well, we go into the heads of other characters. Um, so that experience of intimacy with a character through an author um, it's similar to when you go to a movie and you identify with a particular character. Of course, you can't get inside their heads in a movie, but you can in a book. So, again, I encourage you to read To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, but the main point I want to make here is that all this is done with words, with language. So this power, being able to identify with a character and to be immersed in a story, uh, you can do that with language. In fact, that's the way people did for thousands of years in terms of art, creating, particularly through writing, a virtual world that you could enter into. So I just wanted to mention that in terms of the reading experience. So again, that's all done with language. How do you recreate that on film? Well, there's varying strategies. Um, but I think I'm going to talk more about, yeah, I'm going to talk about more the narrative of the film in a little bit. So here are my notes. Okay. Um, I come at both the book The Hours by Michael Cunningham and the film The Hours. It's kind of a personal experience for me, because I read the book when it first came out in 1998, um, at a time when I was trying to write a similar novel in terms of a novel. And the subject was about AIDS, the AIDS epidemic, and attempting some stream of consciousness narration. So, in that sense, whenever I see the film, that's what I'm thinking about in terms of the AIDS novel that I was writing. It's not been published. It probably never will be published. And the thing about 1998 is that's coming near the point, at least in the United States, when the AIDS epidemic was being transformed into a chronic disease. But my novel was actually based on experience that I worked as a home health aide with people, men living with AIDS in the early 1990s, when it was not a chronic condition, it was a death sentence. So I had the honor and the privilege to help some men with AIDS achieve a good death, and that's an art form in itself. But I was there to help, and I was there when a number of my clients or patients, or however you want to call them, passed on. So that was somewhat reflected in my novel. So it's reflected in The Hours as well. And Michael Cunningham created one of the great, AIDS novels. But of course, you don't see too many of them these days. There once were, a slew of, not a slew, but there were quite a few of AIDS films, AIDS melodramas, I'd call them. Probably the most familiar to you might be the Philadelphia Story. That's a different film. Uh, the film with Tom Hanks, in which he plays a lawyer dying of AIDS. Philadelphia, yeah, that's what it was called, just Philadelphia. Um, so, I mean, that's a film to see if you want to get a sense of what it was like during the AIDS epidemic. That's a good film to look at. There's another one, Long Time Companion was one of the first ones to deal with AIDS, and there are a number of other films as well that did that. So, um, all right, let me spend the rest of a couple minutes anyway talking about The Hours, the book and the film, compared to another book and film adaptation. The book is Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. It was made into a film by the Wachowski siblings. You might have heard of the Wachowski brothers. They are the ones who created the Matrix trilogy. Larry Wachowski has since had a sex change operation, or gender reassignment, or whatever the term is. And Larry Wachowski, now Lana Wachowski. Anyway, that's sort of incidental. But I was actually reading this week an article in the New Yorker about the Wachowski siblings and their film Cloud Atlas, which they did with Tom Twyker, the director of Run Lola Run, and another, actually, a film that I like more called Heaven. So Cloud Atlas is also considered, like a lot of the books that we've been dealing with in this class, as impossible to film. The reason is it's quite an experimental novel. It has 6 different narratives, and each of the narrative begins. Uh, Narrative 1 begins, say, and then halfway through it stops. Narrative 2 begins, and so on. That goes through 6 narratives. Then once it hits the end of the 6th half, then it reverses in order, and so all the stories are completed. There is a theme of reincarnation and karma in the book, but it's sort of slight. what happens in the book in terms of the way these three narratives are knitted together is basically one of these narratives in the form of a book or journal or what have you is basically influences the next narrative. So, say in the second narrative, characters will refer to the first narrative, and that goes on through all six. So the connection is done in a literary way, in terms of one text influencing another text, and so on into the far, far future. So that's something that works quite well in a book. I mean, it's something you can do in a book. It's still difficult for a lot of readers. It's still a very literary work. It has its challenges, but that logic of tying the narrative together works. How do you do that in a film? That's pretty hard. I mean, I'll just mention that The Hours is also very difficult to film. And it's an example of an impossible to film book that actually succeeds. The way they do it in terms of the three different narratives in The Hours, of course, is done visually, sort of visual punning. There's visual connections, you know, in all three narratives. Someone breaks eggs. All three narratives, someone kisses someone, so on. So that's sort of the logic of the film in terms of adapting the book was how do we knit these three narratives together? Well, one thing we do it visually by having, you know, basically the punning or rhyming images. How do you do that with the Cloud Atlas? What was their solution in terms of they did not follow the narrative structure of the book, and that's understandable. You really can't do it on film. If you read the article in the New Yorker, it's basically they knew from day one that this was going to be a difficult sell. They had a hard time finding funders. They finally made the film. It is a beautiful film. It is visually a very stylistically wonderful film, but it bombed at the box office, and that's because narratively it was more or less incoherent. So the strategy the filmmakers chose to sort of knit the three narratives together is that um, they had the same actor play different roles in each of the stories. So there's six stories. For instance, Tom Hanks plays six different roles in the film. So it's an interesting strategy in terms of using your actors as a way to tie together these three disparate narratives that are in the book, actually. I mean, slightly, as I said, slightly connected. But instead of using a sort of literary cues, having a text influence of text, they instead have actors um, playing different roles, and these actors in terms of in their reincarnations they they develop and become a better person. The way they sold the film was Tom Hanks starts off as evil and he ends up being good. So that maybe that was the only choice that the filmmakers had to try to make it work. It didn't work in terms of it didn't bring in any audiences, and it was sort of, as I said, incoherent. I mean, basically, you get going on a story about 15 minutes and then it switches to another one, and that can be a bewildering experience. In the book, when you're reading it, you figure out what's going on, you figure out that logic, and so you're not as frustrated. You know the story's going to be completed at some point. But as I said, audiences did not receive the film well, and the Wachowskis, they sort of knew that. That it was going to be a real uphill climb to get audiences to see it. So anyway, I wanted to bring in another impossible to film adaptation, comparing it to The Hours. The Hours succeeds in their sort of visual strategy for translating the book narrative works, whereas in Cloud Atlas it does not. So I'm getting at 14 minutes, so I'm going to stop so YouTube will upload this. So later.